Sir, if you ask her to marry you tonight, you'll lose far more than your heart. The words were barely louder than a whisper, yet they struck Ethan Brooks harder than the orchestra filling the grand ballroom of the Kensington Plaza in downtown Manhattan. Crystal chandeliers poured warm light across polished marble floors. Champagne shimmered inside towering glasses. A string quartet drifted through the room with effortless elegance while the city's skyline glowed beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything had been designed for perfection. Every flower had been imported. Every guest had been carefully chosen. Every camera was waiting for the exact moment America's youngest billionaire technology CEO would kneel before the woman everyone believed was about to become the future Mrs. Brooks. Then a young black waitress carrying a silver tray quietly stepped beside him and changed everything with a single sentence. Ethan slowly turned toward her, confusion replacing the practiced confidence that had built a multi-billion-dollar empire before his 40th birthday. Her name tag read Naomi Carter. He had never noticed her before. Why would he? She had spent the evening doing what exceptional servers always do, appearing only when needed and disappearing before anyone thought to remember her face. Yet something in her calm expression refused to match the panic such an outrageous interruption should have created. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't searching for attention. Her steady brown eyes carried something far more unsettling than fear. They carried certainty. Around them, the celebration continued without anyone realizing history had quietly changed direction. Victoria Sinclair stood only 30 feet away, laughing gracefully among investors, philanthropists, and executives. Her white evening gown reflected the golden lights like polished silk, and every magazine in America would have described them as the perfect power couple. Beautiful, successful, untouchable. Ethan himself had repeated those words often enough that he almost believed them. Tonight had been carefully scheduled down to the minute. At exactly 8:45 p.m., the quartet would begin his late mother's favorite song. At 8:47, the lights overlooking Central Park would dim. At 8:48, the ring hidden inside his jacket would appear. Every detail had cost money. Every second had been rehearsed. But no amount of planning could prepare him for a stranger quietly asking him to destroy the evening himself. Naomi lowered her voice even further. "I'm sorry for speaking out of place, sir. I know what this could cost me. But if I stay silent, it'll cost you much more." Ethan stared at her as though trying to solve a business negotiation that suddenly refused to obey logic. Employees did not interrupt billionaires during proposals. Waitresses did not risk their careers to offer personal warnings. And complete strangers certainly did not look at him with the quiet compassion usually reserved for old friends. Before he could ask another question, Naomi gently stepped backward, balancing the tray as if nothing unusual had happened. She disappeared into the moving crowd with the same quiet grace that had hidden her all evening, leaving Ethan frozen between two futures. One promised applause, headlines, and the life he thought he wanted. The other began with 8 impossible words spoken by someone the room had barely noticed. For the first time in years, the man who always trusted his instincts found himself wondering whether the most important voice in the ballroom belonged not to the woman waiting for his proposal, but to the waitress everyone else had overlooked. Naomi Carter had learned years ago that people often revealed the truth when they believed no one important was listening. That was the strange gift of wearing a black apron instead of an expensive suit. Guests rarely remembered her face. They almost never remembered her name. But they spoke freely in front of her, convinced that someone carrying sparkling water and clearing dessert plates could not possibly matter. She never corrected that assumption. She simply listened. Every shift became a lesson in human nature. Every table told a different story. Every smile carried a different purpose. At 26, Naomi worked 6 evenings a week at the Kensington Plaza while spending her mornings driving her mother to dialysis across the East River. The bills arrived faster than the paychecks. Sleep often became a luxury measured in hours instead of nights. Even so, she refused to let hardship make her bitter. Her mother had raised her with one simple belief. Character was what you protected when nobody was watching. That lesson stayed with Naomi longer than any paycheck ever could. She noticed details other people rushed past. A wedding ring quietly removed before a business dinner. A nervous glance exchanged across a crowded ballroom. A conversation interrupted the instant another person approached. Small moments rarely meant anything by themselves. Together, they formed patterns, and patterns almost always pointed toward the truth. During the past month, Ethan Brooks and Victoria Sinclair had hosted several private dinners at the hotel while planning tonight's celebration. Naomi had served nearly every one of them. She never intended to pay attention to their personal lives, but certain moments refused to be ignored. Victoria smiled warmly whenever Ethan entered the room, yet the moment he stepped away to answer a telephone call or greet an investor, her expression changed with remarkable speed. The warmth disappeared. Her attention shifted elsewhere. Twice Naomi had watched Victoria secretly exchange messages on a second phone that never appeared whenever Ethan returned. One evening, while collecting untouched coffee cups after midnight, Naomi accidentally overheard Victoria speaking softly near the balcony. She was not flirting or arguing. She sounded impatient. She said, "Everything will be finalized after the announcement. Just be patient." The words themselves proved nothing. Business executives spoke in mysterious phrases every day. Still, something about the conversation lingered in Naomi's mind because Victoria immediately ended the call when she noticed someone approaching. A week later, Naomi watched a man in an expensive navy suit deliver a thick envelope to Victoria in the hotel lounge. There was no greeting, no handshake, only a quick exchange before both walked away in opposite directions. Ethan never appeared to know the meeting had happened. Then came the smallest detail of all, the one that disturbed Naomi the most. Every time Ethan spoke about building a future together, Victoria looked at the engagement ring with admiration. Every time Ethan looked away, her eyes drifted toward the executives discussing mergers, company shares, and investment portfolios. Naomi had seen genuine love before. It looked nothing like careful calculation. She wrestled with her conscience for days, telling herself it was none of her business. She was a waitress, not an investigator. She could lose the only job keeping her family afloat if anyone believed she had crossed the line. Yet each passing dinner made silence feel heavier than the risk of speaking. Standing in the ballroom that evening, watching Ethan reach inside his jacket while the musicians prepared the next song, Naomi understood that some moments never came twice. If she stayed quiet, she could protect her job. If she spoke, she might protect a life built on trust. In the end, the decision was no longer about courage. It was about living with herself after the music stopped. Ethan Brooks had built his reputation on seeing opportunities before anyone else did. Investors called it instinct. Business magazines called it vision. Competitors simply called it unfair because he always seemed to recognize patterns hidden beneath numbers long before the rest of the market caught up. At 38, he had transformed a software startup founded inside a tiny Brooklyn apartment into Brooks Dynamics, one of the fastest-growing artificial intelligence companies in the United States. Financial networks praised his discipline. University graduates dreamed of working for him. Fortune magazine described him as the rare executive who could make billion-dollar decisions without raising his voice. He believed success came from asking difficult questions and trusting evidence instead of emotion. Yet the greatest irony of his life was quietly unfolding beneath the crystal lights of the Kensington Plaza. The man who questioned every contract had never questioned the one person closest to his heart. Ethan rarely spoke about his private life, not because he enjoyed mystery, but because he genuinely believed some parts of life deserved protection from headlines. After losing his father while still in college and his mother only a few years after launching his company, he had buried himself inside work until work became the safest place he knew. Board meetings were predictable. Algorithms behaved logically. Markets eventually rewarded preparation. Human relationships were different. They required trust before certainty, and that was a language Ethan had spent years trying to relearn. When Victoria Sinclair entered his life 18 months earlier, she seemed to offer exactly what endless success never could. She appeared graceful without seeking attention, intelligent without competing for the spotlight, and patient enough to understand the impossible schedule carried by the leader of a global company. His closest friends noticed how easily she calmed him after difficult negotiations. His employees quietly admitted they had never seen their chief executive smile so often. Even Ethan himself began imagining a future measured not by quarterly earnings, but by holidays, family dinners, and a home that finally felt complete. That dream explained why tonight mattered so much. The proposal was never intended to impress the business world. It was meant to honor the promise he believed they had already built together. Standing near the center of the ballroom, he slipped one hand into the pocket holding the velvet ring box, but instead of confidence, he found uncertainty waiting for him. Naomi's quiet warning echoed louder than the music surrounding him. He searched the room until his eyes found Victoria again. She was laughing with several board members, elegant as ever, perfectly composed beneath the golden lights. Nothing about her behavior suggested deception. Nothing looked suspicious. Anyone watching from across the ballroom would have seen the picture of happiness. Yet Ethan suddenly noticed something he had never considered before. Whenever someone mentioned company expansion or future investments, Victoria listened with remarkable focus. Whenever conversations drifted toward family traditions or personal memories, she politely excused herself within minutes. The observation felt unfair, perhaps meaningless, perhaps completely innocent. Still, once doubt entered the mind of a man trained to analyze patterns, it refused to disappear quietly. Ethan closed his fingers around the ring, but did not remove it. For the first time in years, the executive celebrated for making fearless decisions chose to wait. Around him, guests continued smiling. Servers carried polished silver trays across the ballroom, and the city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls as though nothing had changed. Yet deep inside, the foundation beneath his perfect evening had shifted. He did not know whether the young waitress had saved him from a terrible mistake or nearly destroyed the happiest night of his life. He only knew one thing with absolute certainty. Before asking the most important question of his future, he needed answers that money alone could never buy. The applause that had been scheduled to celebrate a proposal slowly dissolved into polite conversations as the evening continued, and most of the guests never realized that the carefully planned timeline had quietly disappeared. Ethan Brooks smiled when people approached him, accepted handshakes, thanked investors for attending, and answered every question with the calm confidence expected from the leader of Brooks Dynamics. Only one person noticed that he had never taken the velvet ring box from his jacket. Victoria noticed it almost immediately. She walked toward him with effortless elegance, her smile warm enough to reassure everyone watching. "Everything all right?" she asked softly. Ethan returned the smile, but years of negotiating billion-dollar acquisitions had taught him that the most valuable answers often came after a simple delay. "I think we should enjoy the evening," he replied. "There is no reason to rush a perfect night." For the first time since they had met, Victoria hesitated before answering. It lasted less than a second, barely long enough for anyone else to notice. Yet Ethan saw it clearly because his attention had changed. Instead of looking at the woman he loved, he was observing the details surrounding her. The tiny pause, the brief tightening around her eyes, the almost invisible glance toward the ballroom entrance before she smiled again. "Of course," she answered gracefully. "Whenever you are ready." She slipped her hand into his, but her fingers felt colder than he remembered. Across the ballroom, Naomi continued serving guests as though nothing extraordinary had happened. She kept her eyes lowered and focused on her work, never attempting another conversation with Ethan. She knew she had already crossed a line that most employees would never dare approach. Whatever happened next no longer belonged to her. She had spoken because her conscience demanded it. The outcome belonged to someone else. Yet as she moved between tables, she could not stop noticing more small pieces that refused to fit together. Victoria quietly stepped away from the celebration twice within 20 minutes, each time claiming she needed to answer family messages. Both times she returned carrying the same composed smile, but Naomi noticed that her evening purse appeared slightly heavier after the second trip. It could have been nothing. It could have been everything. Near the back of the ballroom, a sharply dressed man Ethan did not recognize exchanged a subtle nod with Victoria before leaving through a private hallway reserved for conference guests. The interaction lasted only a heartbeat. Most people would have missed it entirely. Naomi did not. She had spent years learning that truth rarely announced itself with dramatic speeches. More often, it whispered through ordinary moments that nobody bothered to remember. Ethan followed Victoria with his eyes as she greeted another group of executives. Then something else surfaced from his own memory. 3 weeks earlier, she had insisted that one of his longtime legal advisors be replaced before reviewing revisions to their future financial agreements. At the time, her explanation sounded reasonable. She preferred someone who specialized in family estate planning. Ethan had agreed without another thought because trust made difficult questions feel unnecessary. Tonight, those forgotten conversations returned one after another like pieces of a puzzle scattered across his mind. None of them proved deception. Together, however, they formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. By the time the last guests began collecting their coats beneath the glowing chandeliers, Ethan had made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not accuse anyone. He would not make assumptions. Before sunrise, every unanswered question would be verified through facts, records, and evidence. If Naomi Carter had been mistaken, he would quietly accept the embarrassment of doubting the woman he loved. But if the quiet waitress had seen what everyone else had overlooked, then the most expensive mistake of his life had almost been sealed with a diamond ring. Long after midnight, the lights inside Brooks Dynamics headquarters still glowed against the Manhattan skyline. Most of the city had gone to sleep, but Ethan Brooks sat alone in the executive conference room with a legal pad, a laptop, and a question that refused to leave his mind. Successful companies were not built on assumptions. They were built on verification. That principle had guided every acquisition, every partnership, and every billion-dollar investment he had ever approved. Tonight, for the first time, he was applying the same discipline to his own personal life. He opened the revised estate planning documents that had been delivered only days earlier. At first glance, everything appeared ordinary. The language was polished. The signatures looked authentic. The financial structures seemed reasonable. Yet the more carefully he read, the more subtle inconsistencies emerged. A voting trust clause had been expanded beyond its original scope. A transfer schedule had been modified by only a few lines, but those few lines quietly shifted significant authority under very specific circumstances. Individually, the revisions could be explained. Together, they raised questions no experienced executive could ignore. Ethan immediately contacted Michael Reynolds, the attorney who had represented him for more than a decade before being replaced at Victoria's request. Although it was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning, Michael answered after the second ring. He listened patiently while Ethan explained everything, then asked for electronic copies of every recent revision. Less than 30 minutes later, Michael called back with a tone Ethan had never heard before. Calm, professional, but unmistakably concerned. Several documents had been prepared by firms that neither of them recognized. More troubling still, certain authorization requests had never passed through the legal review process required by Brooks Dynamics. Someone had carefully built a parallel paper trail that looked legitimate from a distance, but collapsed under close examination. Ethan thanked him and ended the call without saying another word. The silence inside the conference room suddenly felt much louder than the celebration had only hours earlier. Still, evidence required confirmation. Before sunrise, Ethan authorized an internal compliance review limited to financial records connected to the upcoming marriage agreements. He also instructed his cybersecurity director to verify communication logs involving several outside consultants introduced during the previous month. Nobody was accused. Nobody was confronted. Facts would speak before emotions ever had the chance. As reports quietly arrived throughout the early morning hours, the picture became clearer. Multiple meetings had been arranged without appearing on Ethan's official calendar. Financial advisors unknown to Brooks Dynamics had been communicating with Victoria through private channels shortly before each legal revision. Even the unidentified man Naomi had seen inside the ballroom appeared on hotel security records after attending several closed business events connected to outside investment groups. None of the discoveries alone proved criminal intent. Together, however, they revealed something impossible to dismiss. Someone had been building plans without Ethan's knowledge while relying completely on his trust. He leaned back in his chair as dawn slowly painted the eastern sky with pale shades of blue and gold. Exhaustion settled across his shoulders, yet another thought quietly replaced it. A young waitress with no wealth, no influence, and every reason to remain silent had chosen honesty over comfort. She had risked her livelihood to protect a man she did not even know. Most people inside that magnificent ballroom had admired his success. Only one person had cared enough to warn him before it was too late. Ethan looked through the conference room window toward the awakening city below and made two decisions before the sun fully rose. First, He would confront the truth only after every remaining question had been answered with evidence. Second, no matter where Naomi Carter was beginning her morning, he intended to find her before the day was over. By 8:30 that morning, the final report rested on Ethan Brooks's desk, and it contained exactly what he had hoped he would never find. There were no dramatic confessions, no shocking confrontations, and no sensational headlines waiting outside his office. Reality was quieter than that, and somehow even more painful. Independent auditors confirmed that several financial recommendations connected to his upcoming marriage had originated from advisors who had never been approved by Brooks Dynamics. Internal compliance officers discovered carefully timed requests that would have granted limited decision-making authority to outside parties if the marriage agreements had been finalized exactly as written. Cybersecurity specialists traced a series of private communications that deliberately avoided company systems while coordinating meetings related to those revisions. Every individual detail could have been explained away. Together, they formed a picture that no responsible executive could ignore. Ethan requested one final meeting with Victoria before reaching any conclusions. He chose a private conference room overlooking the Hudson River, not because he wanted privacy for himself, but because dignity deserved one last chance even when trust had been broken. Victoria arrived precisely on time, carrying the same effortless confidence that had once made every room feel brighter. She smiled as she entered, expecting another conversation about wedding plans. Instead, Ethan quietly placed several folders across the polished walnut table. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse her. He simply invited her to look through the documents. For several long moments, only the distant sound of ferry horns drifting across the river filled the silence. Victoria slowly turned the pages, her calm expression becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. She attempted to explain that certain advisors had only been trying to simplify future planning. She insisted that misunderstandings often happened during complicated financial preparations. Ethan listened without interruption because true leadership required patience before judgment. When she finished speaking, he asked only one question. Why was all of this hidden from me? The room became still. Victoria looked toward the windows instead of answering directly. That silence carried more weight than any argument she could have offered. Ethan finally understood that the relationship he believed had been built on openness had instead depended upon selective truth. Trust could survive honest mistakes. It could not survive carefully concealed intentions. Without anger or bitterness, Ethan closed the folders and quietly informed her that both the engagement and every related financial arrangement would end immediately. He wished her well, stood from his chair, and walked out of the room with the same composure that had carried him through countless corporate negotiations. Yet this victory felt nothing like winning. Protecting an empire was easier than accepting that the future he imagined had never truly existed. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, another face entered his thoughts. Naomi Carter. She had asked for nothing. She had expected nothing. She had not tried to embarrass anyone or gain attention for herself. She had simply chosen honesty over convenience because her conscience demanded it. Ethan realized that the most valuable warning of his entire career had not come from consultants, attorneys, or executives earning six-figure salaries. It had come from a young waitress whose only reward for telling the truth could easily have been losing the job that supported her mother. Looking out across the busy Manhattan streets, Ethan made one final decision. Before another business meeting, before another board presentation, and before another interview requested by the financial press, he would find Naomi Carter. Some debts could never be repaid with money alone, but gratitude deserved to be spoken face to face, especially when it came from the one person brave enough to tell the truth that everyone else had failed to see. The address in Naomi Carter's employee records led far beyond the glass towers and luxury hotels where Ethan Brooks normally spent his days. His driver slowed along a quiet residential street in Queens lined with aging brick apartment buildings, neighborhood grocery stores, and small diners opening for the lunch crowd. It was an ordinary place filled with ordinary people living ordinary lives. Yet Ethan realized it had been years since he had walked through a neighborhood without reporters, executives, or security surrounding him. Today he came alone. No assistants. No legal advisors. No photographers. Only a simple envelope resting on the passenger seat beside him and a conversation he knew could not happen through a telephone call. Naomi had just returned from taking her mother home after another dialysis appointment when she noticed the dark sedan parked outside her building. At first, she assumed someone had made a wrong turn. Then the driver stepped aside, and Ethan Brooks climbed out wearing a navy jacket without a company logo, carrying none of the authority that usually filled every room he entered. For a brief moment, both of them simply stood there. The billionaire who had spent his life making impossible decisions suddenly found himself searching for the right words, while the waitress who had spoken fearlessly inside a ballroom now looked genuinely surprised. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, "I did not expect to see you here." Ethan offered a small smile. "Neither did I, until this morning." He glanced toward the modest apartment building before looking back at her. "May we talk for a few minutes?" Naomi nodded and led him to a shaded bench beside a small community garden where children laughed on the nearby playground. The setting could not have been more different from the grand ballroom where they had first spoken. There were no crystal chandeliers above them, only maple trees moving gently in the summer breeze. No orchestra filled the air, only distant traffic, birds, and the voices of neighbors greeting one another. Somehow the simplicity made the conversation feel more honest. Ethan took a slow breath before speaking. "You were right." The words came without hesitation. "I verified everything before making any decisions, and because you chose to speak, I discovered the truth before it was too late." Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. "I was afraid I might have been wrong," she admitted. "I prayed that I was. I never wanted to hurt anyone." Ethan looked at her with quiet respect. "That is exactly why I believed you. People seeking attention usually begin with certainty. You began with concern." Naomi smiled gently, but shook her head. "I only did what I hoped someone would do for my family if we were ever in the same situation." Ethan sat silently, allowing those words to settle. Throughout his career, countless people had offered advice because they wanted contracts, promotions, investments, or influence. Naomi had expected none of those things. She had risked everything simply because she believed another human being deserved the truth. Ethan finally placed the envelope on the bench between them, but did not push it toward her. "I cannot repay integrity," he said softly. "There is no number large enough for that. But I can make sure courage is never punished." Naomi looked at the envelope without touching it. She had no idea what was inside, and strangely, she did not seem curious. Ethan noticed that too. In that quiet moment beneath the shade of the trees, he understood something every balance sheet had failed to teach him. Real character was easiest to recognize in people who never measured their worth by what they could receive. It was measured by what they were willing to risk for someone they barely knew. Naomi finally picked up the envelope and opened it with the same careful hands that had carried crystal glasses through crowded banquet halls for years. Inside was not a check. There was no luxury gift certificate, no deed to a house, and no dramatic promise of instant wealth. Instead, she found 3 neatly organized documents. The first confirmed that every outstanding medical bill related to her mother's dialysis treatments had been paid through a charitable health foundation funded personally by Ethan Brooks. The second was a full scholarship to one of New York City's most respected graduate business programs, covering tuition, books, transportation, and every required expense. The third was a formal invitation to join Brooks Dynamics after graduation in a leadership development program designed for future executives. Naomi looked at the papers in silence before slowly lifting her eyes. "You are offering me a future," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Money can solve today's problems. Opportunity can change the next 40 years. Naomi carefully placed the documents back inside the envelope. "Then I can accept this," she answered. "If it had only been money, I would have thanked you and said no." Ethan smiled for the first time that day with genuine relief. He had spent the drive to Queens wondering whether anything he offered might accidentally diminish the dignity of the woman who had protected him. Instead, she reminded him once again why her character could never be purchased. During the weeks that followed, their lives continued along very different paths, yet both carried the quiet influence of that afternoon beneath the maple trees. Naomi finished every remaining shift at the Kensington Plaza with the same professionalism she had always shown. She never mentioned Ethan's visit to her coworkers. She never told guests about the investigation that had followed her warning. She simply continued doing her job with the same quiet excellence that had always defined her. Meanwhile, Ethan instructed the Human Resources Department at Brooks Dynamics to expand its leadership recruitment program beyond traditional resumes and prestigious universities. He spoke to senior executives about looking for integrity as carefully as they measured technical skill. During one board meeting, he surprised everyone by saying that the greatest risk facing successful organizations was not a lack of intelligence, but a failure to recognize wisdom when it appeared in unexpected places. Nobody in the room understood that those words had been inspired by a waitress carrying a silver serving tray. Months passed, and autumn slowly painted New York with shades of amber and crimson. Naomi attended classes during the day, studied late into the evening, and continued caring for her mother without complaint. The work was exhausting, yet every lecture reminded her that someone had believed in her potential before she had fully believed in it herself. Ethan occasionally received short progress reports from the Scholarship Foundation, but he never interfered with her journey. The opportunity had been his gift. The achievement would belong entirely to Naomi. Looking back, both of them realized that the most important decision had never been made inside a glamorous ballroom or a corporate boardroom. It had been made in a single quiet moment when one ordinary person chose honesty over comfort, knowing there might be no reward at all. Some people spend their entire lives searching for someone powerful enough to change their future. Naomi discovered that sometimes the future changes because you choose to protect someone else's, even when no one is watching. And Ethan learned that the strongest foundation for any lasting success is not built with wealth, influence, or status, but with courage, gratitude, and the simple willingness to do what is right. 1 year later, the headquarters of Brooks Dynamics looked much the same from the outside, its glass walls reflecting the Manhattan skyline with quiet confidence. Inside, however, something had changed that could never be measured on a financial statement. The company had expanded, new products had launched, and investors celebrated another record-breaking year. Yet Ethan Brooks often said the most valuable improvement had nothing to do with technology. It had everything to do with people. That autumn afternoon, the executive boardroom welcomed a new group of leadership associates selected from thousands of applicants across the country. Among them walked Naomi Carter, no longer wearing a black apron or carrying a silver serving tray. She entered dressed in a tailored navy business suit, her shoulders straight, her smile calm, and her confidence earned through months of relentless study, discipline, and perseverance. Several executives greeted her with admiration, unaware that only a year earlier she had quietly served dinners only a few blocks away. Ethan watched from the far end of the conference room before standing to introduce the newest members of the leadership program. When he reached Naomi, he paused for only a moment before extending his hand. "Welcome to Brooks Dynamics, Miss Carter," he said with genuine pride. Naomi smiled and shook his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks. I promise I will earn the opportunity you gave me." Ethan gently shook his head. "You already earned it the night you chose honesty over comfort." The room became unusually quiet. Nobody fully understood the meaning behind those words except the two people standing at the center of the conversation. Months later, Naomi completed the program at the top of her class and accepted a permanent position within the company's strategic planning division. She approached every project exactly as she had approached every restaurant shift, by paying attention to details other people overlooked. Her reports became known for identifying risks before they became crises. Her colleagues respected her because she listened before speaking, observed before judging, and always placed integrity ahead of recognition. Ethan often smiled whenever board members praised her remarkable instincts because he remembered where those instincts had first revealed themselves, beneath crystal chandeliers, while carrying a serving tray no one else had bothered to notice. Outside the office, Naomi's life transformed in quieter but even more meaningful ways. Her mother's health stabilized with consistent medical care. Their small apartment slowly filled with laughter instead of worry. The future that once seemed impossible had become something they could finally plan together. Yet despite every new opportunity, Naomi never forgot where she came from. Every month she returned to the Kensington Plaza, not as an employee but as a guest, quietly thanking former co-workers who had encouraged her through difficult days. She also established a scholarship for hospitality workers pursuing higher education, believing that talent should never be limited by someone's job title. Looking back, Ethan realized that the greatest danger he had faced was not losing money, public image, or business influence. It was losing the ability to recognize genuine character beneath ordinary appearances. Naomi discovered something equally important. The courage to speak the truth may not change the world overnight, but it can change one life, and sometimes that one life reaches thousands more. Their paths had crossed because of a single quiet warning spoken at exactly the right moment. One person possessed extraordinary wealth. The other possessed extraordinary courage. In the end, only one of those qualities had been powerful enough to save them both. Power can build companies. Intelligence can create fortunes. But character remains the one investment that never loses its value. Because the people the world overlooks today may become the very ones who rewrite someone else's tomorrow.